with us Professor Earl O. Heady. As many of you know, he's currently a professor here at Iowa State. He's also the director of the Center for Agriculture Development, which is a program that has greatly influenced the course of agriculture in many developing countries. Professor Heady has been a visiting professor at many universities throughout the country, including Stanford University and Harvard. He's also been on several national committees, including the White House Committee on Domestic Affairs, and as a member of the Research Advisory Committee of the U.S. Agency for International Development. His work experience has involved over 40 countries, and Professor Heady was recently elected to the Soviet Academy of Agricultural Sciences. Professor Heady is the only ag economist among the few selected Americans in this academy. Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Earl O. Heady?
Thanks, Bernie. Students and fellow Iowa Staters, this isn't going to be a formal lecture. It's going to be an informal discussion. It is a treat to be back on the program of the Institute of World Affairs and look out over the world as you have tried to do all of these years and are still doing. The theme of this year is, of course, the North and South confrontation or cooperation. We could use a lot of synonyms for this. We could use rich and poor countries, or we could use developed and undeveloped countries, or we could use the industrial countries and the agricultural countries, or we could almost use the climate to define the difference of these countries, the temperate countries and the tropical and subtropical countries. It has always long been a mystery to me why there has been as much difference in wealth and progress of these two sets of countries as there has. I have asked anthropologists. They can't give me any good answers. I've asked historians. They haven't been able to give me good answers. They said, well, the North captured the South and colonized it, but I always wondered why the South didn't capture the North, colonize it, because of the difference in climate and investment that had to be made in the North in living conditions, energy, and clothing to keep alive during all those cold winters, while those investments weren't necessary in the South. So I didn't think that was the answer either. My discussion here is to deal with food production potential and the resources for it. In these two parts of the world, I think in a way there has been both cooperation and competition in the use of food and food resources in these parts of the world. Before World War II, the undeveloped countries, partly because of distribution within their own countries, were net exporters of grain to the developed countries. I say this wasn't because the undeveloped countries, the South was so rich that it consumed all the food it wanted and all the grain and animal products it wanted, and therefore shipped the surplus off to the North, but simply because the distribution of income in the South, in the undeveloped countries, was such that many people couldn't buy even all the grain they wanted to use, and it went to the North. Since World War II, however, the so-called South, the undeveloped countries, have been net importers of grain from the North, and this is accentuating. It looks like that this will even increase in the future. So in a sense, there has been a kind of cooperation between the North and South, the developed and the undeveloped countries in post-War II period, in the sense that grain has started to move, food has started to move from the North to the South. There has been considerable cooperation of the North in trying to increase the food-producing capacity of the South. The United States has invested in these programs through AID and the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and some other small foundations. Northern European countries have also made investments in this sort of thing. These groups of countries have set up an organization of research over the country and the regional research centers. Some you have heard of, such as CEMIT in Mexico, which specializes in corn and wheat, IRRI in the Philippines, which specializes in rice and related commodities of there, ICRISAT in India, which specializes in arid, semi-arid crops, the Potato Institute in Peru, the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria, a veterinary center in Africa, the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. So these countries have been cooperating in this sense of making investments and trying to improve research and its communication to the world in improving food production. There may be competition in the future, though. It may continue, even though we do have cooperation. The competition may be quite subtle, and it may be through the marketplace. I think we have already seen quite a big development and rapid step in this in the last decades as the Russians and the Eastern Europe countries stepped into the market, changed their institutional outlook, and stepped into the market. They were able to bid for much more grain and to drive the price up much higher so that it was less available to the less developed countries or the so-called South or the poorer nations. And this may be where we see a considerable amount of the competition or non-competition in the future. I would expect that the northern countries, the richer countries, will continue to make investments in trying to improve agricultural knowledge and science in the South, the food producing ability. How effective they are in that will depend upon how effective changes are in the market of the North to consume more food and to outbid the South. Maybe the time will even come whether, well, people in the North raise questions about birth rates in the South. They say they ought to be lowered, and it looks like they ought to be lowered if the South is going to be able to feed itself. I suppose the South someday can start asking the North, should it eat so meat and so much grain through meat while they have so little? Or it may come to a time when the South may ask the North, is it really going to burn grain in its automobiles in the form of alcohol while there's less grain in the South? What kind of arrangements do we make through the market? Many of these plays will come through the market. So one big question then is how much food can be produced in the future in the world, and the ability of the South to be fed will depend certainly to an important extent on the total supply of food that is available. I look for the real price of food in the future to increase, maybe not much in the next 10 or 20 years. Iowa farmers right now wish that the real price of food would increase and farm prices weren't so low. We got an increase in the real price of food at the turn of the century, which gave rise to the parity price concept that American farmers have long been interested in. But after the 1920s, we were able to drive the real price of food down for 50 years, up to now and including this time, meaning that how much work it takes to buy food is less now than it was previously. How much of other things you produce to buy food is less than it was previously. So over a 50-year period, the real price of food has declined and been low. And part of the question in the future, I think eventually the real price of food, if populations keep increasing as they are way out in the future, will increase. And this will mean less accessibility of food to low-income countries. The cooperative aspect will be probably trying to keep the price of food as low as we can, even though it rises, so that more people can reach. There are really three kinds of food problems. One is a purely stochastic weather-related event when there are big droughts over the world, such as there were in the 60s and 70s, and prices rise very high, and many people are temporarily excluded from the market. I'm not really talking about that kind of a food problem today. There are ways to handle that kind of a problem, and that is for the world to build an appropriate buffer stock, carryover grain that can be used in droughts. It hasn't been done yet, probably be a long time till it is done. At the present time, we in the United States have to take care of that problem pretty much by ourselves, that is buffering our own commodities market. The only example of this kind that exists is a small one that I and some others at Iowa State University helped work on. In 1973, we went to Thailand, and they were concerned about the world food situation and the scarcity of grain and the effect it was having on prices in Thailand, so they had us build for them a buffer stock for Thailand, how to insulate grain from the market and hold it in good years to bad years. And about 4 years ago, that model was extended and adopted by all the Asian countries, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nation, which includes Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore. Now they do have this program in effect. It's the only place, but this is a way to take care of that problem, and it's not the longer run problem. There is a problem of people suffering malnutrition, particularly in developed countries, even in developed countries. Some people estimate there are 500 million people who suffer malnutrition, who are not fully effective mentally or physically because they suffer malnutrition. Some people put the number of people in absolute poverty at 1 million people in the world. These are people who lack health care, housing, food, and suffer in various ways so that they are not fully capable mentally, but at least 500 million. And this is a problem pretty much of the distribution of income in those countries. It's partly a matter of the total supply of food in the world and its real price, but particularly the distribution of income in these countries and what policies the governments have to see that low-income people do get food. And maybe even if we produce more food, there would still be much of this kind of hunger. But then there is a third problem, and that is kind of that old race between food supply and food demand as represented by the number of people. The world, the United States, concerns itself with this problem sometimes. In fact, I say it goes through kind of a frenzy cycle on this problem, that there are times that it's in great frenzy over this problem of the world, the lack of food for the world. And then there are times like now when it doesn't really care because we and the world have been producing so much grain in the last 2 or 3 years. The price of grain is low in the United States, and the farmers pressed the government to pay them for taking land out of production next year so that less food would be produced. And the government finally succumbed or agreed, and now we have announced a program where we will produce less food next year. But I have seen those frenzy cycles come and go, and I expect sometime out here in the future, in the next 10 years, we will have bad weather over the world again, and the world and the United States will get concerned about food. I say I've seen this once right here on the campus of Iowa State University back in the 1950s. In the United States, we were worried about our ability to produce enough food, and there was a program called the Fifth Plate Program back at that time. Our birth rate had increased in the United States, and the nation was concerned whether it could feed this every fifth plate that was going to show up at every table. So they had every state make an analysis of how much food it could produce. We did in Iowa. I served as co-chairman with an agronomist on estimating how much food we could produce in Iowa. We estimated by 1980 we could produce 85 bushels of corn per acre. And the committee thought it was so far out they wouldn't even let us publish it. And by 1979 we produced 127 bushel per acre. But then we got surpluses later in the 1950s, and we forgot all about that until in the 1960s there was drought on the Indian subcontinent, and the price of grain went up, and the local farm bureau, this county farm bureau over here, passed a resolution saying we never need more government programs, that the problem of food scarcity was now forever before us. And we had a Democratic administration, and Orville Freeman was Secretary of Agriculture, and he thought that too from his advisor John Snitker, and he let out acreage a bit. We had supply control in effect, and he let out acreage a little bit, and the next year we had a bigger crop and prices were low, and we had an election, and Richard Nixon just barely beat Hubert Humphrey by a margin of about Midwest farmers. So if I guess if we'd never had that scare, probably Hubert Humphrey had been elected president and Richard Nixon wouldn't, because farmers were very upset about this greater production. But we forgot about it in the mid-1960s. We came back to it again when there was drought. Eastern Europe bought much grain. There's drought over parts of Asia, and particularly in Africa, and became very concerned, started some world steps towards it. Now I say we're at the depth of that frenzy cycle again, but we'll be back on the peak of the frenzy cycle again someday. And we do have to keep this problem continually before us so that we don't fail, so we don't flub the opportunities that exist in the long run. Some people are pessimists that we can ever do anything about this problem because population will continually outrun our ability to produce food. I tend to agree, based on some of my own work, a bit more with the optimist. I think that at least for the next 40 years, we can produce ample food, ample in quotes, more food, and make people better off in the world than they are at the present time if it is distributed appropriately. And we have been making some progress. We've made some progress in food in the developing countries. So I remember the last figure, in the last decade, the developing countries increased food production about 3% per annum. The developed countries about 2.7%. And population increased in the developing countries about 2.7%, and in the developed countries about 1.2%, so that a little more food is available every place, even the developing countries. Maybe food production per capita increased by 0.4%. At least it was better, not worse. Maybe it was better for some people and worse for others. And about 1.5% for people in the developed countries. So some progress has been made. And I believe progress can be made for the next 40 years, which gives the world some time to do something about the demand side. The demand side especially is related to the number of people there are in the world. Some earlier figures we have made indicates we believe that for the period up to 30 years, we can probably increase food production by 2.7% per year, while population in those countries, in the developing countries, while the population would be increasing at no faster rate than 2.5%. FAO has out a relatively new set of estimates, which I think are quite good estimates, and they say that the world could, over the next 30 years, increase food production by 3.7% per annum. Not the world, but the developing countries. And against a population increase in these countries of 2.5%. This is the North and the South again. This is the rich and the poor again. This is the temperate countries and the tropical countries again, where this difference is taking place. So it would seem that there may be this possibility for the future. I think the total restraint is not physical, biological ability to produce this food. It's probably more economic policy constraint, more social policy constraint than physical restraint, that it probably can be done if the right programs are carried out. So now trying to estimate where this food might come from. Probably the best source is doing something we know a lot about, and that is increasing yield per acre. It's not something new. We know a lot about doing that if we aren't coming to the trail of how to do it, but it's something relatively easy to do. And there's probably is the biggest opportunities to increase yield per acre in the developing countries, the countries of the South, the countries of almost the tropical climates. I say there is large opportunity to do this. You look at some figures. Back in the mid-1930s, the less developed countries were producing 1.14 tons of grain per hectare, about the same as the developed countries were producing, 1.15. I suppose you get out your statistic books, made analysis of variance, insignificant difference between the two of them. By the mid-1970s, the developing countries, the countries of the South, those of the tropical climates, had increased their yields to 1.4 tons per hectare, about 23%. And the developed countries had moved up to 3 tons per hectare, 160%. And of course, this was the time of the big revolution in the North, particularly the United States, new varieties, chemical farming, and so on and so forth. So even if the less developed the South, the tropical countries just came up to the temperate countries, all those cold countries, the rich countries, that would make a big difference in food production. Or another illustration of the same possibility is the fact that up to the recent past, the developed countries have had about 36% of the cereal area over the world, and have produced about 60% of the world's cereal supply on 36% of the area. Less developed countries have had 64% of the area and produced only 40% of the world's supply. So that's a big gap. If you brought the less developed, the South, the tropical countries up to the north, that would increase food supply by 67% itself. So I say this is a big opportunity. Well, isn't all that good land in the north as compared to the south? Maybe the better land's in the south. I don't know whether we have any soil scientists here or not. It doesn't freeze there. The ground isn't covered with ice and snow half the winter like it is in the north. You can grow more crops per year, not only increase yield per acre. So there is a big opportunity just in yield per acre yet on land that's already producing crop. Second opportunity is to use land more fully and more readily. And that opportunity is especially in the South, the developing countries. The developing countries roughly conform to the tropical world. The developed countries, with some exceptions, roughly configurate with the temperate part of the world. So there are opportunities here, given irrigation development, so there can be more crops raised per year through a lot of multiple cropping, growing several crops per year, even through some intercropping, growing several crops at the same time. This is another big opportunity that exists particularly. We may have quite a lot more of that in the United States. Some agronomists tell me that in another 20 years we'll be double cropping, at least clear up to the Minnesota border. I don't know whether we're going to get much further than the Missouri border or not, but certainly the developing countries have a big opportunity. Then there are possibilities of more land as a source of food. Some people are quite optimistic about how much land there is. I don't know whether they have any soil surveyors in the room or not, can give us the exact answer on it. FAO has a statement that half of the world isn't covered with ice, and half of this non-ice covered world could be put into crops, but only a fourth of it is. That makes a lot of land which would be available. There is only about 22% of the land in Africa under cultivation at the present time, only about 15% of Latin America, only 45% of the world per the statement from FAO. And some people say we can almost triple the amount of land which could be produced. I think these are quite optimistic figures, that there probably isn't that much safe land that could be brought into production, but there probably is a lot of land that could be brought into production. There could be some in the United States. The last survey by the Soil Conservation Service said there were 127 million acres that roundly, we have Dave Post back here as an expert on it, roundly could be converted to Class 1, Class 2 cropland. And maybe there's some more out there, since the old survey showed 265 million acres. But that's a large proportion of our land. I suppose if prices have stayed like they were, like farmers thought they were going to in the 1970s when they paid all those high prices for land, $4,000 an acre and so on and so forth, would it look like soybeans were going to stay at $12 a bushel and corn at $5 a bushel forever? If they had stayed at those levels forever, we would probably have a lot more of that land in production now. We have quite a lot more in production. But this would also be true of the world. There'd be a lot more land in production if prices were up there stable and high and so on. Of course, there are some costs involved, that is cutting down jungles the first time, and the second growth in the jungles, replacing the fertility after 2 or 3 years, and maybe holding down some erosions on some mountainsides and so on and so forth. But there just is a lot of land that could be produced, could be used for production. I've been amazed going to Indonesia and seeing the skill with which these farmers have terraced mountains as steep as the Rocky Mountains, but in a little different climate than the Rocky Mountains, and are producing high yields, partly because their labor is so uncostly. But there are, I say, these first figures I cited to you, I think are too optimistic, but I think there is land there that can be used. Another source is by saving more of what is produced. There's some wild figures quoted on how much crops are lost after they're produced, even after they are harvested. Even after harvest, lost estimates run from 17% to 33%, and some people say even in Russia, the Russians lose 25% of their grain production. This is of reasons we know: the rats and birds in the fields, and the poor storage, and the rats and rodents and spoilage and mold and so on while it's being stored, and particularly of more perishable crops like potatoes, but even of more staples like rice and wheat. So there could be some possibility here. People have been working on it quite a lot. We don't seem to have made much progress on it yet. Then, of course, there would be another way to get more food for the world, distributed more evenly, and that is if the people of the rich countries, the north, the temperate area of the world, ate less meat. I don't know whether they need that meat to keep them alive or not. They eat a lot of grain through meat, a large amount, 35 or 40 bushels per capita goes through meat, while people in the developed countries eat very, very little. And some figures indicate if the meat eaters ate less meat, if they ate only a third as much meat as they do and filled in the rest with plant proteins and so on, we could wipe out hunger by spreading the rest of the food grains around the world. Now, I don't think that's going to happen very soon. That's a fairly controversial way of solving the world's problems. One way it could be solved by some kind of edict, but I can't see any president of the United States that's going to tell Americans they can't eat meat, or any leader probably in Northern Europe. Not even the Soviet Union is going to tell the people they can't eat meat. They're trying their best to get the grain to eat more meat. It could be done through the market, but I think you'd have to increase the income of all people in the developed countries to maybe the level of Great Britain. If they all had the per capita income of Great Britain, then they could bid for the grain against the animals of the world. They might bid, say, corn up to $40 a bushel and be unprofitable, feed it to hogs and cattle, and people would eat it. But I suppose it's going to be quite a while before their per capita incomes are up to that level, so they do it. That would be another method of doing it. Well, I say it does look then through these sources. These are sources. I think there are ample sources here, and it's not a physical, biological limit to what can be done. It's more other things. But just to be able to do it is not a certainty that we will do it, that the world will do it. I suppose we could have all of the biggest and best and fastest football players at Iowa State University that are amassed at all the universities. We could have them all here, but if they didn't practice all week and just went out and played some games on Sundays, having all of this power here wouldn't guarantee us that we're going to win a football game every Saturday. And I think this is true of the world, that we have the ability there doesn't guarantee that we are going to produce that much food. We have the ability. We have to do some things to produce the food. In FAO's calculation, we could produce this 3.7% food per increase per year over this next 30 years from these sources I've mentioned, say getting 16% of it from more land, using more land of the world, 14% of it from more intensive farming operations, more multiple cropping, better use of irrigation water for more crops, interplanting where it's a feasible thing, and 70% through new technologies that increase yields. So that's where the potential would be. Now, what are the restraints, the hurdles to accomplishing this that we might eliminate and, in fact, realize these possibilities? Well, I have down several here. One is a general undervaluation of agriculture that's taken place in the South. The northern countries, in a way, have valued agriculture more than the southern countries have in their programs. In other words, the developing countries haven't put enough priority on agriculture. They haven't given it as high a value as they have some other industrialization or building an international airline. Maybe part of building an international airline is all right. We do some things for our ego, the Russians do. They put up, orbit a few rockets and so on, and the developed countries orbit a few airlines and so on and so forth. It may be just a little bit of the same in there, but it has been a relatively small investment of capital in agriculture, given the number of people that work in agriculture, given the proportion of the national incomes that come out of agriculture as compared to other sectors. So this is one aspect of the undervaluation of agriculture. Another reflection of the undervaluation of agriculture has been the amount spent on research, agricultural research and investment. The southern countries, the underdeveloped countries, kind of the tropical countries, have spent only about 25% to a third as much on agricultural research. We would be pretty starving in this day and age in the United States if we hadn't made this mammoth jump forward since the turn of the century, once we had used all the land, settled all of it, that we have made. We now produce about 3 times as much corn on about a little more than half as much land as we did in 1910. These are the proportions. The rest of and this, our ability to do this has been out of the research and development, the investment we've made for our agriculture. A third, and they use many ways of doing that, all the way from just putting price ceilings on to putting export taxes on, and many countries do. There's some outstanding examples in the world. One outstanding example would be Egypt. The Egyptians took lessons from the Russians for a while. Now they're taking lessons from others. While the Russians were there, they taught them the old Russian system. You have farmers make deliveries, you keep the price low, and you milk a little off of agriculture to invest in the rest of the country. That's the way the Russians did in early days. The investment came out of agriculture for the rest, and so we're going to do the same now in Egypt. Well, consequently, they got some prices so low, farmers have to make deliveries, let some go in the market, that wheat straw has greater value than wheat grain at the present time because there's no price ceilings on beef. You can feed wheat straw to beef, therefore wheat straw is worth more. And also, instead of planting wheat, they plant clover to feed the cows because they produce more beef. I say you find these kind of examples all over, like the rice export tax in Thailand. Since the export demand is more elastic than the domestic demand, by putting a tax on exports, they drive more wheat back into the domestic market, drive down the price for all the urban consumers. So there is a lot of that. Maybe that is one of the biggest obstacles over the world in producing more food, the kind of pricing policies that they have. Another is effective institutions, having institutions that work. In a lot of developing countries of the South, of the poor countries, they have institutions, they have extension service, they have organizations that are supposed to deliver fertilizer and chemicals to the farmers and so on. They have people, but nothing happens, just like having a stalled car out here on the road. They have the people in place, and all that sort of thing and so on. Nothing just happens. There's no leadership there. People don't know how to do things. They just need to almost hire a consulting company to come in and run these organizations, sometimes even to run the government. I was once in Saudi Arabia, and Litton Company came in, and while I was there, and made an offer to the Saudi Arabian government that they let the Litton Company run the Saudi Arabian government. Well, that was kind of a far-fetched sort of thing, but that's kind of almost what's needed in getting some institutions going, or to get enough people trained that make them work. So that's a big problem. It's not unimportant getting people in the institutions so that they work, so the capital's there when it's needed, the fertilizer's there before it gets hard in the rain, so on and so forth, and so people know what the varieties are. Another is lack of capital, sometimes at the farm level, sometimes the level of big projects, irrigation projects, water distribution systems, so on. I sometimes think it's less a matter of capital in the developed world. They've been able to do pretty well in borrowing from international monetary organizations and even private banks in the West. They've been quite successful at being able to get funds from there. And maybe capital, it is a restraint. They could use more of it. but maybe it's less of a restraint than is management. Another is trained manpower. It's estimated that these developing countries south need 30,000 college graduates per year for the next 25 years to be able to build all of these institutions and getting them to work. Another is environment. I talked about the additional land that might be brought back into production, but some of that is fragile land, and if you cut down the tropical forest, it might turn into just a big sludge pot, or cut down the trees, it might turn into a desert in some places. If you cut off the trees someplace, it might erode the mountain. So we can't put all the land, but we do need to work on methods of conserving land and keeping it so that it can be used. Another problem is equity of income distribution. A lot of people are hungry in these countries because they don't have enough money to buy the food, and there hasn't been a way set up for them to get food. If all we were interested in was producing food the world over, increasing the world's food supply, I have an idea of how we might do it. We might offer franchises to farmers in the north, the developed countries, the cold climates, to go and farm in the southern part, poor countries, the warm climates, give them franchises. They farm there for 25 years. They can have all the profit they make, all the food be produced. I'm sure you get a lot of Iowans go down South America and Southeast Asia, and they would learn soon and produce food. But we can't do that because we aren't just interested in producing food. We're interested in employment of the people in those countries and the distribution of food and income to them. So you can't travel as fast as you would like to on producing food because of the equity consideration, that you have to attain some equity in the distribution of income and wealth. Then another big important condition is stability in governments and social systems. There has to be enough certainty that people are willing to make investments, farmers are able to make investments, and then in the infrastructure around farming is sometimes a restraint on producing more food. For example, the Indonesians have a big transmigration project to take people, it seems to me all Indonesians want to live on just one island, Java. You almost have to have a transmigration problem to get them to live on Sumatra. But when it comes to all those outlying islands where nobody lives, then how do you get them to live out there? They don't want to move away from Java or even Sumatra. But you're going to have them live there. You have to make some vast investment in infrastructure, roads, schools, and so on and so forth. So there is a big investment that's need to be made in infrastructure. But otherwise, I feel quite confident that the world is coming up on a time when it has enough trained manpower and enough managerial ability to overcome many of these restraints. We are much better off now than we were 30 years ago. Think about 30 years ago when many countries just become uncolonized and they had nobody run the country. They had nobody who had experience. We now do have many more people who have experience than had back at that time. We need more people, but I think that we're much better off than we were in the past, and that it can be done. So I think we can on the food side in a 40-year period. At least we have 40 years to progress and have a greater supply of food per capita over the world if it is divided equitably, and if per capita income in the north doesn't rise so high that it's all bid away from people in the south through the market. And so that's one side of it. Of course, that doesn't take care of the other side of it. That is the size of the population on out beyond 40 years, and the size of the demand because of that reason. And there's some very complex things that have to be awaited, but I would have hope here too. As I said to some of you before, these are complex things. Part of them partly revolve around women, increasing the economic and social opportunities of women. I have a couple of little figures I'd like to quote about this. For women in the developing countries, these are quantities been derived in developing countries. One is the elasticity of births with respect to income. Increase the income of a woman by 1% in the developing countries, and you'll decrease births by 1/3%. Increase education of women in developing countries by 1%, you decrease births by 0.25%. But increase education of men in developing countries by 1%, and you increase births by 0.25%. Well, it's a matter of giving women opportunities, social and economic opportunities, and letting them be a little materialistic, I suppose. If we want something to happen, that they can buy goods. If you take Eastern Europe, they've been very concerned about their population. They've had to turn around and pay people for having children and give them a lot of other advantages. The reason that people stop producing children, you might say it's socialism, but that really isn't the basic reason. Or I suppose the other answer would be if you looked at those countries, the obvious answer for developing countries, since it seemed to work in Eastern Europe, would be to have socialism in the developing countries and cut down the birth rate. But the real reason, I think, was that housing was small. You had a house for room for about 3 people, and you only wanted 1 child or 2 children. And women could get jobs, and the family wanted to buy an automobile, and they wanted to buy a television set. A woman was going to work, and they were going to have the things they wanted. This economic opportunity, the woman was skilled enough to do this sort of thing. I suppose quite a lot of the same thing has to eventually happen in the developed countries. Then another aspect of the same thing almost is Social Security, pension security in one's old age, and in a lot of the world, as we know, a large number of children is tied to the need to have Social Security, income security in old age. Have to have 8 children, so you get 4 boys to take care of you. That's a very complex sort of thing. I just see last week, perhaps you read it too, that in the Chinese program where they had limited through a system of penalties, urban people to 1 child and rural people to 2 children, that now people, particularly urban people, who have a firstborn girl are killing the girl so that they can have a son. So this might distort the population makeup and have some serious consequences itself. So I say it is a very complex sort of problem. So I am quite optimistic. I am optimistic that we can still keep producing food. There is one bit of pessimism going around even in the United States, which says we probably are approaching a yield plateau in the United States and in developed countries. We have to depend almost entirely on the developing countries to produce food in the future. They say that we have now, in the last 40 years, fertilized all acres. It'll be fertilized in the United States, North America, so you can't get that gain in productivity anymore. We have used almost all of the Ogallala aquifer, so we can't get that gain in food production anymore. So now we are out here at a peak in our food production, and some people would cite figures from the recent past, the 1970s, to show how this is true. On the other hand, there is a group of optimists who don't believe this is true. I and some of the fellows sitting in the room are holding a symposium in Washington, D.C. the first week of December. We're going to explore this problem particularly. We have all of the best agricultural scientists we can find in the United States who's going to examine how much land we in the United States have that can be used for food production, what the yields can be for 50 years from now, to what extent we endanger the base of our food production through erosion or conservation and so on. But after beginning to review some of the literature, I am even somewhat optimistic on this sense, that if we continue investing enough in research, both the private sector and the public sector, that we can keep on going up the trend line here for quite a long period into the future. But we